John chapter 18, verses 33 through 37. Listen for the word of the living God as we read these words. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My reign is not from this world. If my reign were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my reign is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." The living God still speaks today. Thanks be to God. I've met numerous people caught up in concerns over power. Looking into my history books, it's the same story, isn't it? Cortez did not enter Mexico on any mission of peace. Columbus did not voyage to what he thought was the east of India to engage in open, fair, and honest trade with India. The Crusades were never about wresting the Holy Land from infidels. Constantine's use of the cross and the phrase "in hoc signo," under this sign, had nothing to do with trusting Jesus. They were all about power, wealth, domination, ambition, control. Even a surface glance at Jesus shows a wholly different focus. Why do we so easily tie God's reign to our concepts of political dominance and love for violent power? You're familiar with my use of the term God's reign rather than the more traditional God's kingdom or the kingdom of God. There's another alternative that is to speak of God's kingdom. You'll hear this often at annual conference and in other places. Both recognize that when Jesus speaks of God's reign or God's kingdom or kingdom, it is not after the manner in which we think of a kingdom. First of all, the Greek term is active, just like the distinction we make in the contrast of the word trust to faith. Second, it makes no geographic reference. It's not delimited by borders where others begin to hold sway in opposition to God and God's rule. Jesus was not concerned with geographical borders. As his ministry roves freely back and forth through Samaria into Phoenicia, Syria, the Decapolis, and throughout Galilee and Judah. He goes out of his way to encounter people beyond the typically we would call borders of Israel, and displays the message and actions of God's reign among them, just as readily as those within. Throughout Jesus' meandering ministry, we see no reference akin to the subjects of God's reign. He calls the disciples servants, but then he also calls them friends. He makes no distinction among those that he heals, feeds, teaches, or rescues from some oppression or another. The gospel takes pains to point out occasions in which Jesus interacts with non-Jews who should not have had any worth to God given standard perspectives on outsiders. John shows him going through Samaria. That was generally a shortcut used only out of necessity. Jesus went supposedly because he was in a hurry, but yet he stops in Sychar and remains there for several days. He says nothing of any political nature to these Samaritans, nor to the man from Gadara, or the Gerasenes, as we sometimes phrase it, another non-Jewish region. He simply invites them into God's presence and service based upon God's love, welcome, grace, and invitation. He ignores concerns of nationality and ethnicity as being irrelevant to God's reign. Now brought before Pilate at the very end of his ministry, an accusation has framed him as being a Christ, a Messiah, an anointed one and appointed by God as prophet and or king. Despite the accusation being false in a sense, it brings him before Pilate, who now evaluates him from the perspective of Roman law as the Roman occupying force in Israel. This accusation classes him as a political threat to Roman sovereignty. It would make him an insurrectionist, just like Judas Barabbas, who had been inciting rebellion against Rome, attempting to overthrow Roman rule in Israel by force. The title of Christ or King was brought up specifically to portray Jesus as a political enemy of Rome, requiring from Pilate a harsh sentence. The conversation between Jesus and Pilate, however, does not lend to finding Jesus a threat, an insurrectionist, or any kind of political opposition to Rome. Jesus claims that king is not his term. It's a term that others have applied. He then describes how different such a threat would appear if he had concerns for political power. He would be at the head of a violent uprising, with followers defending him against all comers. If he were a political figure, he would wield violence, force, and coercion. He would be wielding death and fear as tools for domination. He was nothing of the kind. The description simply did not fit reality of who he was and what he had been doing. It ignored his character, his identity, his actions. If Jesus stirred up people, it was not for demonstrations of power or violence or autonomy or supremacy. He stirred people in speaking against the manner in which wealth and power were used for control and dominance, not merely by Rome, but also by the power brokers among his own people. He countered both the religious power of the Pharisees as well as the political and economic power of the Sadducees. He was not interested in swapping out a team of players to continue the same political game. He strove to revolutionize the essential ways we relate to one another, altogether circumventing human concerns over power. Rather than a society held together by fear, domination, and force, he called for a social order built upon the singular foundation of love. Interestingly, Jesus confronts Pilate not only with this definition of his reign not being on the same order of Rome's political reign, he also states that his followers would otherwise have revolted to keep him from being handed over to the Jews, his own people, with their secondary political system that was subjugated by Rome. His use of the term does not refer to the Jews as a whole, as the vast majority of his followers and himself were Jews. His use of the term refers to the Jewish political machine that was held in check by Pilate as Rome's representative. If Jesus were to establish a political organization to counter Rome, he would likewise need to counter the Jewish political power structure as well, if not first. As it is, Jesus was not concerned with any kind of reign that needed the structures of a military, a court, or any of the other trappings associated with political power. His concern was wrapped up in proclaiming what he calls the truth. It's somewhat a strange use of the term as Jesus wields it, isn't it? Indeed, as the entire Gospel of John uses the term. Truth here is God's revelation to humanity. It's the truth of God, the truth from God, the truth about God, and yet it goes beyond that to be the true message that God has in Jesus for all humanity. This is the truth mentioned in John's first chapter, claiming Jesus having made visible the grace and truth of God's identity. It's the truth that reveals the character of one's actions as described in John 3. It's the truth to which Jesus had directed the Samaritans at Sychar in John 4, through which all would serve God in spirit and in accord with this revelation of God's truth, God's true character. It's the truth of God's revelation that Jesus referred to in chapter 8. It's the truth of Jesus' communication of how we come to live with God in chapter 14. It's the truth by which God sanctifies us in John 17. This truth is not simply a compilation of knowledge. It's the revelatory witness of God which Jesus has been sharing throughout his entire ministry, throughout his life. Power is not integral to this truth. This truth that Jesus came to represent is altogether different. This truth is overflowing with authority, but it is not limited or delimited to the application of power through any political sphere or doctrine of governance. The power of this revelatory truth is not wrapped in fear, the ability to cause harm, the means to inflict punishment, torture, or even death. It's not even threatened by the violence of these political tools to which we as human beings so easily gravitate. The power of this truth is in the transformation it provokes in our lives and through them throughout the society all around us. For those Jews tied to political ambition who handed Jesus over to Pilate, this truth was a threat to their purpose. This threat undermined their dependence upon power to manipulate and bend people to their personal agendas. It did not have to be that way, except that their agendas did not follow with God's purposes of amplifying life, amplifying and multiplying blessing, blessing to and for all. That flies in the face of the way we wield political power and influence. Humanity has long wielded power with an eye to control and dominate. We use power against others, rather than on behalf of others. The truth of God's revelatory grace in Jesus runs the opposite. When God reigns, it's to the benefit of all. Is that what we seek? Is that what we are after?